All right, here we go. So we're going to be talking about a couple different things, primarily satellite imagery, 3D modeling, but we're also going to talk about some of the other tools that we use for verifying certain activities around the world, which also extend into things like photo forensic software and using social media to track events live as they happen. So some of the things, some of the things that make the Center for Non-Proliferation so prolific at monitoring world events and then kind of understanding, analyzing, and producing reports on things related to WMD are exploiting different types of mediums that so some are traditional and some are new, and some we know we just don't use them in the way that I guess other people would. So that goes from photo forensic software, social media platforms, satellite imagery, and 3D modeling. The first slide here we have is myself and my colleague in DC, Catherine Dill, learning how to use a photo forensic software called Tungsten. It was made by a French mathematician on the right side of the image, Roger Cosium. And what he did was he came up with a way to interpret and work with ground imagery in a way that we could verify the authenticity. It doesn't tell you whether or not something is real or fake, but what it does is it allows you to reinterpret the image in a way that tells you the scale or degree of authenticity. So here is him showing us how to do some of the band math on that software. One of my favorite filters on this photo forensic software is called isocleans. And what it does is it takes light information on the photo and allows you to extract whether or not there is actually a heat source in the image. So if I were to Photoshop a flame into an image, you wouldn't get the way light passes around this flame tip right here. And we can see that if this photo were authentic, we can see these wavelets around the image. This is important because we can use this for images of missiles. So here we have a very famous surface-to-air missile test from a Iranian news outlet. And if we were going to run the isoclean filter on this image, we should expect to see the same type of wavelets that we see right here. Running the isocleans filter on this image, we can see that there is data that shows that this heat source right here is authentic. It's, hold on a second, there we go. True to the way we would expect to see it. Now, this would be important because if it is, what do you call it, a forged image with a fake heat source, we wouldn't see these wavelets around the exhaust. This is important because when we look at North Korea's missile program as it develops, we want to know whether or not the missiles that they're testing have actual heat sources to test the authenticity of the image right here. So like this image right here, if we have the exhaust, we should expect to see the manipulation of light passing through a hot area, which we see right here. Running the filter on this, what we ended up finding was that the heat source did not reflect around the heat source in the image. Going back, we should expect to see the wavelets happening around the exhaust here. When we run the filter, we see that there's a lot of contour and distortion happening lower in the image, but not around the missile or around the exhaust of the missile, which is a sign that this image has been tampered with or that the image is not necessarily as authentic or true to source as we would like to have for analyzing this photo. So it turns out, in my interpretation, while this answer remains somewhat unsolved, that I think the North Koreans took this part of the missile right here, and it was originally here, and they moved it up. That's why we see in the isocleans filter that the wavelets contouring around a heat source, which would be the exhaust, were down here versus it being up here. And it turns out that when you test a SLBM as you develop through the different stages, one of the first things you do at sea after you've tested it on land is you do an ejection test. So essentially the SLBM, submarine launched ballistic missile, will come out of the water, it will ignite and then splash back into the water. So I think the North Koreans dragged the missile up a little bit higher to exaggerate the type of test that they did. And when we got video footage from this event, it went from the ejection from the water to a straight CG film that would have made Pixar proud in like the 1990s. So this is a really cool and interesting way to use photo forensic software to analyze, assess ground source imagery. Go back and forward. This is what it did look like. This is what it should look like. Those two things are very different. Next is using social media like YouTube or things like Snapchat to verify events live as they happen. I believe it was a year or 2 years ago, the Houthis were launching a series of Iranian-made ballistic missiles at Riyadh. And we got images like this showing that these missiles were being launched supposedly from Yemen. I mean, the launches were happening from Yemen, but we can see that they've blurred out some of the background images so we couldn't geolocate where these launches were happening, which made it very difficult because they were very aware of the type of analytical skills that people can use using ground source imagery and satellite imagery to figure out where an event's happening when they don't tell you. But it turns out, in order to verify whether these launches were happening or where exactly they were happening, when tragic events happen, people will often pull out their phone first instead of seeking safety and cover to hide from events like this, like a missile launch at Riyadh. So what we did is we took videos like this from YouTube and we went to a popular social media app called Snapchat, which has a heat map. And when you go to the heat map, you can see, depending on the settings that the individual Snapchat has posted, videos happening around the world live. So if missiles were landing at Riyadh, what you would expect to see is a bunch of people recording on Snapchat and posting these things online, which we did. So live as these events were happening, me and a couple other colleagues at the center in California at the time were able to log into Snapchat and see not only the debris from the missiles landing, so debris from missiles like this landing over Riyadh, but we were able to see videos of people recording the missile defense system going off. And in most cases during this specific event, the missile defense system failed in a rather, I guess, spectacular way, because on the image here, what we can see is the surface-to-air missiles going up and exploding prematurely. And then in the image on the left, what we ended up seeing was a video of one of the surface-to-air missiles launching to intercept one of the incoming missiles, turning around and then landing next to the battery that had launched it. When North Korea or any other country shows us videos of testing to show development in their WMD systems, whether it's a nuclear test or predominantly missiles for my area that I focus on, they'll show us a video like this or an image like this, and it shows a solid fuel rocket motor being tested horizontally, but they won't tell us exactly where it's happening. So what we have to do is we have to use geolocation skills to apply a place and more context to an image that the North Koreans are showing us. In this example right here, we have a solid fuel missile being tested at Hamhung, or Namhung technically, which is just south of Hamhung, North Korea's east coast. One of the interesting things about tests like this is that since it's horizontal, a lot of the heat and exhaust from the rocket is going over vegetation. Using satellite imagery, and specifically the near-infrared band, we can monitor the vegetation around test stands like this to see whether or not they're testing. This is a satellite image. It looks a little weird because I've replaced the red with the near-infrared band. So what you'll see is a lot of vegetation, if not all of it, is now a shade of red. This is primarily used in the agriculture field as a way to determine vegetation health. So instead of going around and checking the health of every single plant, you can take a satellite image or often drone footage of your field. And then if you elevate the near infrared band, you can see that the brighter red sections are healthier vegetation. The areas without red don't have vegetation. The areas with light red have sparsely populated or less healthy vegetation. The test stand that we see in the image right here is right here. And if we do before and after comparisons, using the near infrared band in the satellite imagery, we can see whether or not they're testing, because as it turns out, when you test a high heat source rocket engine or something of that nature, or you just do crop burning, the vegetation right here, obviously the test stand will become discolored if they had done a test. In this next image, we can do a comparison. This is October 7th, 2017, and this is after a suspected test on the 17th. So we have a bit of a gap. We don't get satellite images of the entire world every day at this resolution. To zoom in, we have that test stand that we saw in the image earlier. We have vegetation right here. And after the test, we can see that all that vegetation is now dead. And this is the flame trench. The exhaust is going this way. All the vegetation opposite the side should yeah, as you would expect, suffer from the test of a rocket engine before and after. We can also use this type of satellite imagery to verify launch locations when the North Koreans do missile testing. Here we have a video or a screenshot from a video of a North Korean missile test happening near an airfield. We know it's near an airfield because this is just what North Korean airfields look like. We can see there's a lot of vegetation around where the missile was tested, so we can use the near-infrared band again to verify the location, not only using geolocation skills and techniques, but using the near-infrared band. Because opposite of the missile as it's taking off, you have a high heat source that would notionally destroy, kill, or disturb the vegetation happening here. Since this is a very green image, near-infrared would be a perfect tool to use to verify launch locations. So we geolocated this image right here to this field. I'll go back and forward. We have this little blocky area with white lines. We have a field. We've got a row of trees or shrubs, and then we've got like corn or some type of grain that the North Koreans run near airfields. We've got this road right here that cuts off in this little rectangular area. Using Google Earth, we can get that rectangular area, the road, the curve. We have this field. This is not an image from the same day, obviously. This is from, I believe, sometime in fall because the vegetation is dead. But we use this as a point of context image to try to geolocate where the launch happened. Using Planet Labs satellite imagery, which is one of the most valuable tools in our asset to use satellite imagery to, I guess, analyze events happening around the world. We can take this image from Google Earth, locate it on Planet Labs, change to a before and after using the near-infrared band. This is where I suspected that they had launched it using the geolocation techniques that we did. And the before and after of the launch, we can see right here, there's this huge discoloration. So this is where the launch happened because the missile had destroyed, disturbed, or killed off all the vegetation around this hedge line. So let's go back forward here. We have the missile launch occurring along this row. It should be right about here. And we can verify that using satellite imagery of things that aren't necessarily optically visible. One of the really interesting research products that we had just recently done based on North Korea's SLBM program was trying to figure out where this submarine was. We know that this is at the Shimpo South Naval Shipyard on North Korea's East Coast, but we didn't know necessarily which building it was in. Everyone had assumed that this new ballistic missile capable submarine that the North Koreans, to the best of my knowledge, haven't launched yet, was being built in their newer building. And if you guys had been paying attention to the news a couple of months ago, there was a lot of speculation as to whether or not the North Koreans were going to launch that submarine based on activity happening around here, as everyone thought it was in this construction hall. However, using internal imagery, we were able to compare features along the row here to the expected way that this building should look like from the inside. We were able to compare internal building features, such as, and I'll move this down really quick, we have this side door entrance right here, this row. Why that matters is because in the building everyone suspected it in, there was a high double row window set, which was set much higher above the door versus the building that it is being built in, which has a door at the same level as a single row window set. So the implications of that mean that when this new submarine gets launched, we'll have no notification unless the North Koreans want us to see them birth the submarine. Another interesting thing about this submarine was that if you look at the roof right here, you can see that there are no window slits. In the suspected building, there were a bunch of evenly spaced out window slits versus the building it's in, which only has 4 skylights that are rectangular. And we can see that reflected in this rectangular light coming through, and it's spaced out by the other light on this side. Going back to Shimpo a couple of years ago, I believe, yeah, 2019. So yeah, it's like 2 years ago. Wait, sorry about that. The North Koreans have been building this area right next to where the submarine's being built, which is over on this side to the left or to the north of this area, for maybe about 6 to 8 years. And no one had known exactly what this was. But since this is the head of, or the main center for North Korea's East Coast submarine fleet, doing a little bit of elbow grease and research, we were able to identify that this is a new submarine training center. So we have the academy side right here. We've got a courtyard for marching soldiers around formation, as it is a military educational center. And right here, we have a large tower next to what are suspected pools. The thing that gave away the purpose of this using satellite imagery is if anyone has spent any time doing research on submarine training, one of the things you often do is practice escaping from a submarine at the bottom of the ocean. If the submarine sinks, in order to do that, you need an escape tower, which essentially is a large tube that you fill with water. Submariners enter from the bottom and then practice going up the entire height of the tube, which is located in here, and we saw it being built with the tube structure and earlier satellite imagery. But now that this looks optically complete, one of the things we want to do is see whether or not it's being used. Is this academy, like, I guess, operational now? Optically, it's complete, but how do we know there are people in there? Well, using Planet Lab satellite imagery, which has a high revisit rate, so we can see the same place over and over again more frequently, we can monitor activities happening in and or around this building, which would be the academic center. Here we have that courtyard again, and through the next series of images, what we'll see is these little shapes happening, moving and changing in the center of this little kind of, I guess, parading field or courtyard. Here we have some objects. This is what people look like at a 0.6 meters resolution. Obviously, you can't tell an individual person, but you can see people when they mass together. In this image, the people are gone. In this image, we can see that the people are starting to take formation because we have some stragglers right here and some sort of shape taking form. There's no one in that image. No one in that image. People again in formation in this image. So using the high revisit rate from Planet Labs, we can tell that not only is this facility optically complete, we can tell that it's operational because they have submariners training in formation in the courtyard of the suspected academic center for the submarine training facility. We're also monitoring submarine developments happening on the West Coast. One of the, let's see if the next slide has it. Okay, it doesn't. Things you do if we go back, well, if we think about the image that we showed earlier with the photo forensic software, one of the first things you do when you develop an SLBM capability is you test it on a barge. You don't test your first submarine on a submarine, or your first SLBM on a submarine, because if the missile blows up, then you lose your submarine, which is arguably harder to make and more expensive. So you put it on a test platform. North Koreans have 2 test platforms for testing SLBMs, and they've used them quite frequently with the newer, larger SLBMs that they developed, like the Puguk 3. But they tested on a test platform, and the other one on the West Coast is located near the largest port of Nampo. It's a bit hard to see, but that is right here. That little test barge had been in this quay for 2 years undisturbed. They'd just been sitting there waiting to be used. And as of late last year, they pulled it out of the water to work on it. Now, the context for that is, why would you test a SLBM on your opposite coast? The North Koreans tend to, they tend to avoid testing over countries if they can. They have a political threshold and a tolerance for what is, I guess, a series of escalatory scales for provocative action. So if a missile test goes into the Sea of Japan or the EC, depending on, I guess, what you want to call it, that is not necessarily as provocative as flying a missile over the strait in between the main island of Japan and Hokkaido, or flying somewhat further north over that. In order to test a larger, longer range SLBM, because you don't necessarily have the length of the country to test over, it makes sense to test larger SLBMs off of the West Coast, because they can fly over North Korea and still get the full range of a lofted missile test. So we've been monitoring this site a couple days a week for, I think, like 3 years to see when exactly they're going to test this, because the minute this test barge goes back in the water, it could be an early indicator that the North Koreans are going to be testing a longer range SLBM from their West Coast, which would be a first for them, but not necessarily unexpected. So monitoring this little guy right here, once that goes back in the water, will help us get a heads up as to when the North Koreans are going to test their longer range SLBM that we haven't seen yet. Unlike traditional satellite imagery that has visual bands that you can see, one of the things that we also exploit using assets from Airbus is synthetic aperture radar. This image looks kind of weird because it's a satellite image taken with a radar. They have 2 satellites flying over a location in tandem. They shoot a radar, it bounces off the ground, hits another satellite, and then they record that data. It's really useful because the resolution is much higher, and it tells you with almost a surgical degree of certainty that an object has moved. If you were to try to drive your car and then park it back in the same spot to make it look like the car had never moved, you might draw lines in the ground and match the tires up, something like that. Optically, it might look as if it had never moved, but using synthetic aperture radar, we can tell with almost absolute precision whether or not an object has moved centimeters, which is pretty wild. So instead of looking for optical changes comparing satellite imagery, we can use synthetic aperture radar, run it through a program which will tell us whether or not things have moved and how often these things have moved. And that is what we're seeing here with the different colors. Also, a really neat thing with synthetic aperture radar is we can see through certain types of material. In the next image or the one after, I'll show you an example. The North Koreans putting up a concealment structure. The synthetic aperture radar actually sees through it, so we can see the beams that hold up the concealment structure. It's like a tarp. They put it over the submarine, so we don't know whether the submarine is there or not. Here's another angle. This is the building. It looks a little weird. Again, this is the satellite image using synthetic aperture radar, where the North Koreans are building their new sub. We have a color code, so things that change often, things that seldom occur, or changes seldom occur. We have the secure boat basin. This is the test barge on the East Coast at Shimpo. And here, if we zoom in a bit, we can see these L-shaped structures. In a normal satellite image, you wouldn't be able to see what's under here because this is a tarp. So using synthetic aperture radar, not only can we see through the tarp because of the material that it's made and the radar is passing right through it, we can see the structure that holds up the tarp, which are these L-shaped structures. And the orange right here is their smaller first SLBM capable submarine. So when the North Koreans launch their new submarine, they may try to hide it under this tarp, but if we want to know whether or not it's there, we can take a synthetic aperture radar satellite image of this site. And if this little orange structure looks longer because they built this larger structure to facilitate their larger new submarine, if it extends all the way down here, not only will we know that the older sub's not there, but that the newer sub had been launched and is hiding under the North Korean concealment structure. This is a really interesting satellite image. It is of North Korea's nuclear test site at Punggye-ri. This is also using synthetic aperture radar, and we're comparing between a series of days, and you'll notice that in this image, the mountain right here is pulsing. Mountains don't breathe, they don't move unless there's an earthquake or some type of seismic structure. During North Korea's last nuclear test, there were rumors that North Korea's nuclear test range made a explosion, or the nuclear test had made an explosion that was so massive that the cavity inside of the mountain collapsed and made the mountain shrink a bit, which is what you can determine using synthetic aperture radar, because using this with the precision of terrain data that we can get from the imagery, we can see here that the mountain actually does shrink a bit, and that's what creates the pulsing effect. So when someone says there are, speculations that North Korea's nuclear test range had shrunk a bit because the explosion was so large, we can use synthetic aperture radar to apply that to their test site. And we can see here that it actually does shrink a bit in their imagery. Using visual satellite imagery, the elevation data that we got from this satellite image right here, and 3D modeling skills, we were able to actually get a grad student, which was pretty neat, to recreate North Korea's nuclear test site. So we had a student throw this up in Blender, import the elevation data from this, and then overlay satellite images from Planet Labs. This is a image from their Dove series of satellites. So it takes a picture of almost the entire world every day with a flock of maybe 200 satellites at 3 meters resolution, which is fine for the purposes we're doing this. You can apply all those 3 things together. So you're taking satellite imagery, terrain data, synthetic aperture radar, and 3D modeling, and we recreated their nuclear test site. The reason why we wanted to do this is we wanted to get a general idea of how much space they have to do further nuclear testing underground, which you can do if you take this model and you flip it upside down. That way you can get a general visual idea of where they could start doing tunneling for nuclear testing, how much space they have, and if you want to, you can try to come up with estimates over overburden for the test site to scale how big the test can actually get. This was all made by a grad student at the Monterey campus for our research center. We also mapped out where their previous tests were, and we had the tunnel entrances pinned out at the start of these little adits that we made. These are purely aesthetic because we don't know necessarily what the North Korean nuclear test adits look like. So we took examples from older American versions and just applied them there for context. But these red dots here are where the North Koreans had done their nuclear testing. And if you want to interact with this model or just check it out, all you need to do is go on the Google, type in NTI North Korean nuclear test tunnel, and then it should take you to their webpage where we have these models hosted. I can also send a link to Jean afterwards if you guys are interested. And then on the note of 3D modeling again, which was really fun, is if you guys have a HTC Vive, Oculus Rift, or Google Cardboard, we made a walkthrough version. So you can actually walk through the entirety of this kind of aesthetically designed nuclear test site. You can see by year where the nuclear test happened in their site. So you can actually walk through this if you have any VR tools. We also took satellite imagery and ground source imagery, and we recreated North Korea's most famous missile production facility, the Chamsin Missile Factory, or Pyongyang Pig Factory, depending on the name you want to use for it. And we made a replica of all of North Korea's ballistic missile fleets to the scale of a 6-foot person, which is also on NTI's website. So if you are interested in learning more about North Korea's missiles, or if you want to actually stand next to a Hwasong 12, 14, or 15, you can do that and get a sense of scale for how large these things are. And this entire facility was made to scale against satellite imagery that we have of their missile factory. So the inside obviously doesn't look necessarily exactly like that, barring the, what do you call it, the roof railings and some of the ground features, but you can get a tour of their missile capabilities, the history of their missiles, and the family and kind of evolution of North Korea's missiles, because on the other side of this image, we have all the older Scud assets, and here's Jeffrey Lewis using a VR headset to explore this missile factory that we made. We also take our 3D models, and using your phone, if you get the Sketchfab app, you can project these in real life using augmented reality. So if you want to share interesting things with your colleagues using your phone, what you can do is you can take your phone and you can, I guess, point it at a certain location, scale up a model. And here we have one of our former researchers, Ann Pellegrino, interacting with North Korea's the hydrogen bomb design that they had shown us. We had a student recreate it with some pretty interesting details, going down to the wirings and the connection points. We have a binary chemical agent weapon right here, and here is a projection of North Korea's nuclear test site on the table at the CNS main site. And that is kind of a tour of us using satellite imagery, photo forensics, social media, and 3D modeling to interact with the topic related to non-proliferation. So if you guys have any questions, I am more than ready.
Thank you, Dave, for this very interesting and practical presentation. It is impressive how you use open sources for your analysis. And I think it's an excellent example on how spatial and data analysis techniques could contribute to monitoring and verification in support of non-proliferation efforts. Being that said, now I open the floor for questions from our participants. Please feel free to raise your hands or unmute yourself or post your questions on the chat. Please, I see Ricardo now. Please, Ricardo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you to Dave for his very explicit and very interesting presentation. I was wondering if whenever you are doing this research on imagery regarding heat sources and everything, do you actually have to get any kind of particular resolution of the photo? I mean, like, because most of these photos usually come, in news outlets or even social media, so the quality of the images are not necessarily the best. So that's one question. And another one is, could you repeat, please, the kind of apps that you use for that? It's really interesting, and I think I'm really getting into that. Thank you.
Sorry, I realized I showed up so late, so I might have just blown right through all the points that I wanted to talk about. But yeah, so the photo forensic software we use is called Tungsten. It's phenomenal. It's Tungsten. The spelling is a little bit different. Again, I can send John the links to pass on to you guys. It's a bit expensive, but it's used by, I think, the French Ministry of Defense for analysis as well. So it does have quite the clientele list. You do need an image that is as close to the original source that it was taken. The app will also tell you or help you understand whether or not you have that image. Compression types, especially when you're talking about social media. If I post an image onto Twitter or Facebook, it will, I guess, loosely compress the image to the point where it's not necessarily usable for the software. But the software will show you that the image is missing a lot of the compression that should have been there in the original image, so you can discard that image for analytical purposes. So if you do have an image that was run through social media a bunch of times, it won't necessarily work as well as if you were using the authentic image, but that also helps you understand whether or not the images are valid for analysis. So if someone gives you an image and it's like, this event happened, and I look at the image using the photo forensic software, it'll tell me, hey, this file size is way too small for the original image, because you still have like a kind of a digital record in some cases of how compressed the image was originally or how much data was there. So you can go back to the person who gave you the image and be like, if you want me to actually verify this, I need something that's more authentic than what you're giving me. And then what was your other question? I'm sorry.
About the app on the cell phone.
Oh yeah, sure. Oh, the app on the cell phone. Sure, absolutely. It's if you give me 1 second here, let me look this up. Yeah, just go to the Google Play Store and download Sketchfab. It's Sketch and then Fab, all one word, and it allows you to, if you have a Google Cardboard, you can slide your phone into your Cardboard or a VR thing, and you can use the VR that way. Or if you want, you can do the projection with the AR as well. And I can send John, again, a link to some of our cooler models. I think if you go to Google, you do Sketchfab, then Nuclear Threat Initiative. See here. Yeah, it should be actually, if you do Sketchfab, then you do James Martin CNS, because we make the models for the Nuclear Threat Initiative. And you click models, you can see everything that we've made, from solid fuel motors, missiles. We've done submarines, Patriot air defense system. We have some ships. We have a really cool model of the B-61, which I made, which I'm very proud of, but I'm obviously biased. We also have some flu models. We have a cutaway of North Korea's nuclear design based on what we saw with satellite imagery. So it's pretty cool stuff. But yeah, that would be Sketchfab.
Thank you, David. There is another question from, I don't see any. Please feel free to ask any doubt that you have or comments.
So Manuel,
Enrique.
go ahead, Enrique. Yeah.
It's just one question. So everything that you just showed us, thank you for that, by the way, but everything that you just showed us, is that just for academic purposes, or do you actually cooperate with, I don't know, the IAA to monitor and, verification processes of the international organizations in disarmament, or is it just for academic purposes?
Sure. So we do all this for academic purposes. Whether or not the agency uses some of our work, I don't know. I do think, and I've heard this from certain individuals, that the type of open source academic work that we use is really good for sharing information between partners without exposing how you know a thing is a thing. So if you work for, like, let's say a government agency and you want to share something with the South Korean government from the Americans without exposing how you acquired a piece of information, so like means and methods and things like that, you can use open source to pass along things that you believe are true, and all of our methods are posted online. So you can reverse engineer our thought, but most, if not all, of our work is done purely for academic funding or just personal interest. So like, I analyze North Korea partially because it's my job. Also, I'm just really passionate about figuring out what they're doing because I can't physically go there. So having satellite imagery from places like Maxar, Planet Labs, and Google Earth, obviously, who collects and displays a lot of the satellite imagery, is very useful. But it's all academic.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
Manuel, if I may, I can't raise my hand because the host of the event.
Go ahead.
And my question is actually very much linked to what Enrique just asked. So I recall, Dave, from an early part of this work when I was still at the CTBTO, there was a lot of interest amongst the analysts and see how they could not only utilize what CNS was doing, but kind of looking at these kind of software applications. I mean, as we will talk tomorrow, the CTBT does not have its own satellites, but it uses extensively satellite imagery. And of course, these are all good examples. So Dave, maybe you can also comment on the value of this for diplomats in advising their governments. I mean, it's open source, and you will say you will share the links, but you may want to say, how can a diplomat who sits in a mission in New York or Geneva or in Capital utilize this information to inform the decision makers in their governments?
Because everything we do is open source, and we're not a U.S. Or government intelligence agency, we don't have the private individual assets to do this work. So we have to rely on commercially available things, and these are tools that you can have access to, right? So you don't need a security clearance, or you don't need to work for a specific government to get access to Planet Labs, Maxar, or things of that nature. Tungsten, the photo forensic software, is a bit expensive, but if you really need to use it, it's definitely worth it. How or why you would use it would, I mean, just open source verification. Satellite imagery is a part of almost every breaking news story now. It's becoming more and more prolific. If a building collapses, if there's a fire, if someone says, let's say, for example, that a site in Iran was on fire or blew up or is expanding, you don't necessarily need to rely on the news source to verify that information. You can just open up your satellite imagery account, and you can physically look at these places and see for yourself whether or not these events are happening. So as we have more eyes in the sky, I think, verification of any news story. If there were troop movements happening on the border of the country you're working at, you can see that using Planet Labs. You can also discover things as well. If you want to share ideas using, I guess, geospatial assets, that's also a really common thing. So I guess it gives you a bigger worldview, no pun intended.
Thank you, Dave. And now we have another question from Marcelo from Brazil.
Guys, hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, Dave. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really quite interesting. My question is, do you have any knowledge whether some countries, in that case, North Korea, know what the satellites and all this stuff can do, and whether the country can use, let's say, countermeasures or deceiving measures to deceive exactly what the satellites are doing, and in that case, let you or let other people who are analyzing the data incur into error? Thank you.
Yeah, so example, in Russia, they have inflatable surface-to-air missile trucks. So if they want to make it look like there are a bunch of trucks out there that are surface-to-air missiles, they can just roll them out and inflate them, and optically, it looks like a thing, but the satellite imagery itself won't tell you that. So if you want to do a countermeasure around that, you can use synthetic aperture radar, which is that radar satellite imagery we saw earlier, because depending on the material, it should bounce right through it and then bounce back. So it would become transparent versus a solid object, which wouldn't necessarily be that way. We know the North Koreans know we're watching. They've known that for a while. Half the country's underground, which is really interesting, but it also makes analysis of North Korea a bit hard. We saw that, and I didn't show it in an image. When we're talking, I'll see if I can pull it up just to give you guys some context to what I was talking about earlier. Google Earth. The North Koreans know that we're watching their submarine fleet, so they put up a structure so we couldn't see whether or not the new submarine was under it, and we got around that using synthetic aperture radar again. The great thing, and I can talk for hours about how awesome SAR is. It could be daytime, it could be nighttime, it could be cloudy, and because it's radar, it doesn't matter. It doesn't rely on light. So that is something the North Koreans necessarily haven't gotten around, because we can still see through the tarp. Once they figure out that we can see through the tarp, which I'm sure they know, they just haven't implemented it yet, all they need to do is add some more solid material under the tarp, and we no longer have the ability to see it. But there are some other images we have where we tasked a satellite to take an image from an angle so you can see under it. So it's kind of like a tit for tat game. We know that they know what we can see and what we can't see. And as technology advances, we'll be able to see more depending on the material of a structure that we're looking at. But there are some things where satellite imagery just has like natural constraints, and that is just how that is. Hold on a second. Let's see if I can do share to show you guys what I'm talking about. Edge info. Perfect. Okay, hold on a second. Screen share, Google Earth. So here we have the location we were looking at using synthetic aperture radar. This is the construction point everyone thought the submarine was in. This thing moving next to it, which is a floating dry dock, is why everyone thought the submarine was going to get launched soon. Turns out that the submarine's being built in this building, and this floating dry dock is actually too small to mate with this pier. So this movement should have been disqualified earlier, but no one had really done the measurements on that. This is the tarp I was talking about. It's a not camouflage, it's a concealment structure. So if we look at older imagery, here we can see the tarp again. It's a bit hard to see against the water, but originally the submarine sits there and there is no tarp. And over time, as they noticed that we were watching this and seeing whether or not the submarine was there or not, because that means that they could be doing testing with it, they put up this concealment structure in, it was like 2019, 2020. So we can't see it. We can see the shadow coming from the L beams. And if we go back to the synthetic aperture radar, and I'll pull it up in a second just to give you some context. There are L beams, metal structures that hold up this tarp. And if I go back to my presentation, let's do a screen share for this one, you'll see that we can actually see through it. There we go. Again, that tarp that we couldn't see through, we can now see through it, and we can see the support structures that hold it up. So if the North Koreans want to, they can throw some wooden boards there and we can't see through it using SAR. Then we have to go back to a different way where we take an image from such an angle that we can look under it, but those images aren't as commonly used or necessarily useful outside of looking under that structure. So yeah, they know we're looking, they do things to counteract what we look at, but again, there's no satellite imagery that I know of that can see underground, right? So if you do everything underground, we're kind of out of luck.